Meanwhile, the leaders of France and the UK are due to travel to Washington next week to hold separate talks with President Trump. They'll present an outline for what's being called a European reassurance force that could monitor an eventual ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. Media reports suggest the plans include a troop level of less than 30,000, protected by US fighter planes if necessary. But as Teri Schultz explains, it's far from certain the Trump administration will agree to provide any such support.
U.S.-led peace negotiations offer no clues as to what conditions might be accepted by Russia and Ukraine in an eventual agreement. But already a week ago, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was detailing tough terms for NATO allies as he assigned them to police this envisioned deal, brokered without them. Hegseth said the force would include only non-American troops.
They should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5.
That means no assured backup from the U.S. if Russia attacks. It's not even clear whether Article 5, the alliance's collective security guarantee, could be applied outside NATO territory. But the U.S. ruling out such solidarity just adds to European angst. And there's a lot of that, like from retired Estonian General Riho Terras, now a member of the European Parliament.
We need to talk about how to win the war, not how to put some kind of undefined peacekeeping force on the peace which does not exist yet.
He says the discussion should be about providing Ukraine maximum defense from the air now, not boots on the ground. Because we have no idea what this peace deal might eventually look like, experts are a bit reluctant to hazard guesses on what kind of force Europe has to come up with to keep Russia on its side of whatever border is eventually delineated. One who's not shy about sharing his assessment is Michael Kaufman from the Carnegie Endowment in Washington. He's just come back from very near the front line in Ukraine, and he's got some pretty concrete ideas about what might work. We spoke with him by phone.
European militaries could deploy a limited ground force, something on the equivalent of 3 brigades, maybe about 15,000 troops. They need about 3 times that, perhaps, for rotation. So a total of 40 to 50,000 personnel.
That's much smaller than the recommendation of former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, for example, who suggests a force of up to 100,000 soldiers led by Britain and France. But Kaufman's concept is based on Europeans reinforcing, not replacing, Ukrainian troops.
Slava Ukraini!
He says they wouldn't have to span the entire front line to create a deterrent to further Russian incursions.
There would have to be some forces by Kiev, maybe by Kharkiv, and then on 1 or 2 directions in Donetsk.
The U.S. is pressuring European leaders for quick decisions about putting their troops' lives on the line. Even though this would not be a fighting force, Kaufman notes a crucial question.
If it is a tripwire force, then what does that tripwire connect to?
Unless the answer to that is the Pentagon, Europeans fear Kremlin compliance with any eventual ceasefire is wishful thinking by Washington. And Russia's quick rejection of the idea underscores that concern. Moscow warns sending European peacekeepers could cause a, quote, uncontrollable escalation.
Let's explore this with Laura von Daniels, who's head of the Americas Research Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. She joins us from Berlin. Welcome to DW. This is all very problematic. European troops on the ground with US air cover. Vladimir Putin has already ruled this out. Can you see his new best friend in Washington going for this at all?
I think what is really the crucial point here is for Europeans to stick to a common approach and make their claim to sit at the table of any kind of negotiations, whether it will be over narrow agreements, broader agreements, and the European contribution to those agreements in terms of securing a peace and providing assistance or providing up to the question of providing ground forces or air patrol. The first thing that needs to be achieved for Europeans is really to get that place at the negotiation table.
And how do they do that? How do they muscle their way onto a table when it's already been made clear they're not welcome?
I think it's already a good start that you see a common approach by the UK and France, who are important, not only nuclear powers, but also in terms of their contribution to NATO is essential. So I guess it's a good approach now to go to Washington and talk to Trump, and also continuously talk to him about the risk of having a narrow ceasefire agreement of some sort with Putin that will then not last.
Forgive me, but you say it's a good plan. Donald Trump has already said he doesn't want American troops there. This French-UK plan relies on US air power. How do they persuade the king, as he's christened himself, how do they persuade him to go for it, to put American lives on the line in a dispute, in a conflict that he wants no part of?
Right. I think that's a fair question, but I think you need to start somewhere. And I think it's right that they use the moment now to start getting into the conversation, trying to claim that seat at the table. And I think when it gets to Europe now, all eyes are certainly on our elections in Germany and the outcome of those elections, and whether you will have a new German government formed after next week, after the elections, that will then go out together with France, the UK, other important countries here like Poland, the Middle Eastern European countries, and the Baltics, to form a common position and then put in their collective weight. I think that is the necessary condition for any kind of those plans that are now being proposed by the UK and France to gain any kind of momentum in Washington. That's for sure.
The timeline that you've outlined there sounds like something that will take months. Events are moving much quicker than that, especially with the German election this weekend and what will likely be months of haggling. Germany will effectively have no government and will certainly not take a strong position on anything before a new government is in place. Europe will get left behind.
You're right that negotiations over a coalition agreement in Germany are likely to take long. Nevertheless, I think it's in the responsibility of the democratic parties in Germany to come out the night of the election or the next day with statements on their continuous support for Ukraine, on a common approach towards Europe's security, together with other countries in the European Union and the UK, and to make clear that no matter which parties are going to be in government in the end, they all follow that same foreign policy and security policy approach. And I think that can be done independently of the actual negotiations over coalition agreements and domestic politic concerns and all of that.
Thanks for joining us, Laura von Daniels from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs.
My pleasure, Phil. Thanks for the invite.
Let's get more on this now from our correspondents Christine Mundwa in Brussels and Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Nick, you first. How are proposals for a European peacekeeping force going down in Ukraine?
Well, certainly this is very welcome, Terry. When Keir Starmer came out with that first comment and said that he was aware that would put British troops in harm's way here in Ukraine, that seemed like a more kind of muscular commitment to put them on the front lines, or at least very close to them, and with the expectation that there might be ceasefire infringements, that Russia might test what this actually means. Since then, it seems like they've rode that back a bit. We've also had analysts just pointing out quite how small Britain's army is right now, only about 70,000 regular kind of military forces, I mean, the army at least. So even if they're sending a couple of tens of thousands here on rotation, that is a huge commitment. But I think the fact that we are there is very welcome, even if they were only to be based somewhere around Kiev in central Ukraine, to free up the Ukrainian army from the kind of hinterland and to maybe shoot down missiles and then allow Ukraine's army to basically focus on the front lines. That already is a big step forward from a Ukrainian perspective.
Christine, which countries have indicated that they might be willing to participate in a Ukraine peacekeeping mission?
Yeah, Teri, I'll start by saying that the idea isn't universally popular here in Europe, but we've heard from France, Britain and the Netherlands, these leaders signaling a willingness to deploy their troops in some kind of a contingent on the condition that a peace deal has been agreed. There is a longer list of countries who just don't want to have the conversation right now, as we heard in Teri's piece from the Estonian general, who think that this discussion is perhaps premature, that there is no peace to be discussing in the first place. So Denmark, Germany are among countries on that list. And then there is the position in Warsaw, in Poland, that countries that border Ukraine should not be included in this at all. So Poland and the Baltics, for example, would be included in that, where the message from at least Warsaw is that any country that borders Russia shouldn't be deploying troops in Ukraine in any capacity for fear of escalation, perhaps maybe following on from the remarks from the Russian foreign minister that Russia would not accept any European troops in Ukraine under any conditions.
Nick, Ukraine has made it very clear that what it needs is long-term security guarantees. Is Europe in a position to provide such guarantees without a U.S. backstop, as the British Prime Minister puts it?
Well, we had a couple of weeks ago President Zelensky saying that basically no guarantees will work without the US. Right now it seems like he might have to deal with that, might have to live with whatever he can get if the US is really pulling out as radically as seems to be the case right now. I think this is a moment where Europe really has to decide whether it is willing to take that step to invest more and to help Ukraine build a kind of peaceful and stable future, or just to accept that it is not capable of these things and that it is going to have a kind of Russian-dominated Ukraine on its doorstep. That is basically the pretty stark choice it faces right now. I think, though, the idea of peacekeepers, that is a commitment, right? Even if they are not on the front lines, that means there is a constant kind of military support being offered to Ukraine, interaction with the Ukrainian military, reinforcement of the Ukrainian military. We've also heard the Europeans now talking about coming up with a new big financing package, potentially talk of actually confiscating those frozen Russian assets in Europe rather than just giving Ukraine the proceeds of the interest payments. So I think this is a moment of kind of total kind of all options on the table, no one really knowing where we're going. But there certainly is a kind of feeling here right now in Kiev that, apart from Europe, Ukraine just doesn't have anyone to rely on.
Christine, as Nick points out, the Europeans are facing a really stark choice. What kind of mission, if any, are the Europeans likely to assemble for Ukraine? Would it be a combat-ready force or merely an observer mission?
Yeah, I think we can almost safely rule out a combat-ready force. But talk has now moved from this sort of 100,000 strong peacekeeping force to a smaller force, Teri, something to the tune of 30,000 troops on the ground in Ukraine, not necessarily on the front line, but deployed in key areas. Think of ports in different key areas in the cities. So that conversation is shifting. Of course, Nick was alluding to the fact that, many countries just aren't in a position to be able to offer the kinds of numbers that would be needed to really put up a strong peacekeeping force, so to say. So again, that American backstop, as the British Prime Minister called it, would be necessary on that front. So that is intelligence support and, of course, perhaps US fighter planes. But we don't know if the United States is willing to make that commitment right now. But certainly the conversation here has shifted to something a lot smaller than what would be required for a classical peacekeeping force, so to say, on the front lines.
And finally, just a quick question, Christine. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Macron are due in Washington next week. Could that visit to Washington that they're going to do bring more clarity?
Well, we're certainly hoping so. We know that going into this meeting, the French president has said he's going to make it clear to the US President Donald Trump that, Vladimir Putin is somebody who you need to deal very strongly with, that you shouldn't be weak in dealing with Vladimir Putin. Perhaps the French president could be speaking from experience, because we know days before that invasion, he had a call with the Russian president and he was assured that there was no invasion going to happen. And look where we are today, almost 3 years later. So the Europeans are really trying to persuade Washington that its interests are in line with European interests. And of course, all of this at the back of, Washington essentially going at it alone, leaving the Europeans out in the cold as it's pursuing this peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. So the Europeans really going in there to indicate that they're still a player in this game and that Washington needs to take Europe along with it in all of this.
Christine, thank you very much. Christine Munwa there in Brussels, and Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Thank you both.
Well, I'm joined now by Benjamin Tallis. He is a security analyst and director of the Democratic Strategy Initiative here in Berlin. Benjamin, it's good to have you with us this evening. This has been an unprecedented onslaught from Washington, a U.S. president calling Ukraine's president a dictator and more. I mean, this has put other European leaders into a state of shock. Where do you think this leaves the state of transatlantic relations?
Well, Brent, good to be with you in this week where it seems like decades have happened. Indeed, this, after a lot of talk of wake-up calls, a lot of talk of the hour of Europe and so on, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where Europeans actually have to get moving, because regardless of what we read into the motivations or the intended goals of the Trump administration, all the questions they're posing to Europe have one clear answer, and that answer is get stronger. Stand up for yourselves, assert yourselves, be able to defend yourselves. Whatever happens in the future with transatlantic relations, right now, Europe cannot rely on the US security guarantee. So it has to be able to defend itself as soon as possible. But in the longer term, we have to be working to work with a US that would be a reliable ally, because we need to be together in the longer term competition we're in.
Yeah, we've seen the White House in the past 4 weeks of this administration. I mean, he was inaugurated just a month ago. We've seen the White House backpedal on several issues after President Trump triggered lots of uncertainty. The list is long, but we're not seeing the backpedaling this time. How do you read that?
Interesting. I think you're right to point to that. There's been a certain extent to which a lot of people have thought they're throwing whatever they can at the wall and seeing what sticks. They're testing out different positions. They're, running with both the hare and the hounds. But this time it doesn't look like it. And that, I think, is what has tipped many Europeans over the tipping point this week, because what we've seen after yesterday's attack on Volodymyr Zelensky, who many in Europe hold up as a hero, an archetypal wartime leader in the mold of Churchill, to attack Zelensky as being a dictator while you're simultaneously cozying up to Putin. I mean, that's not the America we know. It's certainly not the America we want, and it's not the America we need. So that's not being walked back is a real problem. And hopefully it finally lights the fire under Europeans getting moving.
Yeah, the Europeans, Benjamin, particularly the European Union, but also the European members of NATO, they are looking more and more like collateral damage in all of this. Would you agree?
100%. Until we actually get our act together and demand that seat at the table, we are on the menu, frankly speaking. And collateral damage is understating it at the moment. I think there's some in Europe, Germany in particular, who are targets of this for their perceived delinquency, for standing up against Trump's worldview, for not being the kind of allies they should have been. But everyone, as you rightly say, is getting caught in the crossfire of this. So I don't think it's actually at the level of the European Union or of NATO we're going to solve this. What we need are coalitions of the willing who can move assertively, who can move fast and move decisively to take the action that we need. And even if it's not perfect, the message to Europe right now is just do it.
I remember not that long ago, French President Emmanuel Macron said he would be in favor for, putting some European boots on the ground in Ukraine if need be. And at the time, most leaders here in Europe scoffed at that idea. How could he? But he was maybe foreseeing the future, wasn't he? Foreshadowing.
Yeah, interesting point. I mean, Macron was preserving what is well thought of as strategic ambiguity by doing that. I mean, Olaf Scholz did his best to ruin that shortly afterwards by providing strategic certainty that Germany would not contribute to that. But the only real overt support that Macron got was from the Baltic states on that, who obviously very, very willing, but with the size of forces at their disposal, would not have made necessarily the material difference needed to make that a significant contribution. It's interesting this week, though, to see it's Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, who's not known as a rash person, not known as anyone extroverted, who has made the running on this. And it backs up what Macron has previously said. And we've seen the Swedes join in, we've seen the Estonians join in. There are many who think this would show that we've got skin in the game and we're willing to actually take some pain to pursue what is in our interest, as well as in accordance with our values. So yes, Macron was prescient on this, but he needs to have the substance to back that up.
Well, does Europe have the substance, though, even if the will is there? I mean, to be able to make up for the slack that would be created, this void that would be created if the United States were to, pull out and remove its security guarantee. Does Europe have the capability of filling that void?
It's the right question and the wrong approach at the same time. Let me tell you why. Because I think the right question is, yes, we have so much lack of capability. We have so many deficits in our capability. The UK, known as one of Europe's strongest powers, is actually incapable of fielding much more than a brigade, which would seriously stress the rest of its military. Germany is being tested to the limit by putting the brigade in Lithuania. The French wouldn't be that much different. But the point is, for now, what we're talking about is not a force to keep the peace or to enforce the peace in Ukraine. So it would be a non-combat deployment. It would be to do logistics, to do training, but mainly for show, in fact, and mainly for symbolic significance, for which some of those troops would actually be valuable. In the longer term, should Europe be required to A, defend itself, and B, defend Ukraine? There is, of course, a bigger question. That's where you're 100% right on this. But we start where we are, not where we wish to be. And taking Teddy Roosevelt's famous mantra, do what you can with what you have where you are. And that's what Europe needs to do now. We need to start moving forward.
But you say a force for show, but wouldn't that be inviting Vladimir Putin if the worst forecasts are correct? Wouldn't that be inviting him to, attack yet another country, maybe in the Baltics, but to, push Europe even further back?
It's an interesting point, and I think it's a valid concern. The question is what we accompany that force with now, because that force doesn't come alone. And accompanying that kind of force with a significant long-range strike capability that would actually hold significant Russian governance, warfighting, and industrial assets at risk would actually have a significant deterrent effect. And ultimately, to deter is to threaten. And what Europe has to show is that it's willing to do that. And putting the force in place would imply that willingness, because it would see a willingness to take pain, but also the necessity to inflict future pain on Russia for credibility should they try and violate that.